Becoming a top 10 player in Geometry Dash platformer mode feels insurmountable due to the constant release of more and more difficult levels. Just 6 months ago, Convolution was top 1. However, after the recent verifications of Meat Tower and Fluorescence, it's probably dropping out of the top 5. Aside from the levels, the players at the top serve as another roadblock for anyone who wants to crack open the top 10 on platformer rank. For those of you who don't know, platformer rank scores players based solely on their top 10 hardest levels beaten. Ever since the establishment of it in September 2024, there's been a group of 5 players in particular who have not dropped out of the top 10 for even a single day. The first of which is perhaps the most well known of the Eternal 5. Before platformer rank, before stiff physics, during the slippery physics era, Aibyou was already at the very top, only second to Tired, the first player to ever complete the entire platformer list. Through consistent grinding, Aibyou would surpass the gap between him and Tired, and nearly complete the whole of the list. However, after Tired's retirement, a new challenger would soon threaten Aibyou's claim to the throne. Much like his competitor, Muzza only had a few levels left on TPL, so the race was on, with Muzza taking a lead after completing the Abyss, the top 1 rated level at the time, and DSTRD, a precise ball speedrun level. After catching up, Aibyou would fire back with completions of 22 Trials of Pain, Terminal Heaven, the hardest slope boosting level, and Bramble Scramble, a level fraught with mini spike corner jumps and really strict UFO timings. It all came down to one singular level, Azarus, a top 3, and by the slimmest of margins, Aibyou cleared the level just 1 hour before Muzza, defending his title of the best player in the world. Muzza would then take an extended break from the game while Aibyou kept on pushing his abilities. In March of 2024, he'd verify Claustrophobia, a level that has several microclicks and a brutal reverse staircase at the end. This level was so ahead of its time that 15 months later, it's still within the top 10. He would then complete Null and ride his momentum as the best all the way to the middle of 2024, where a player would surpass him on the newly created platformer rank. However, to this day, he's never missed a level before it goes into Legacy on the platformer list, an accomplishment that nobody else has been able to replicate. Samamba had a fairly rough start on platformer rank. He dropped down to 10th only a few days after he joined. However, after his verification of Heavy Metal and his completion of Null, he managed to bounce back to 5th. His next few months would be relatively quiet, as he'd fall all the way back down to 10th at the end of 2024. His time was running out, as Pink Empress would crack the top 10 the very next day. But by the slimmest of margins, everything suddenly clicked. Within the span of 2 months, Samamba would complete the Cave of the Scarlet Sky, Ascend, Eve, Claustrophobia, MF KAIJI Sunday, Convolution, and verify Heavier Metal, hitting a peak ranking of number 3. From then onwards, Samamba would remain consistently ranked within the top 5. He's most well known for his creations of Kill the Panas 1 and 2, Estufa, and also his verifications of Heavy and Heavier Metal. In addition, he recently won the first top player race against GToast, Aibyou, and Tanuklen. Within the first month, Tanuklen would climb into and maintain a top 5 ranking, up to his current day. In fact, they'd reach a peak ranking of number 2 through an early completion of Convolution, and were only behind the same player who first surpassed Aibyou. After months of trading various positions with Aibyou, Cobster, and GToast within the top 5, in February 2025, Tanuklen would reclaim the number 2 spot through a completion of KAIJI, a level that the majority of top players feel like essentially is RNG. This time, however, he'd never fall out of the top 3 afterwards. What's more impressive is that he's doing this while verifying an upcoming top 1, Nautical Nightmares. Tanuklen also verified Nullspace, a much more difficult reimagining of Null. The next of the Eternal 5 is Cobster, who was in the community as early as Aibyou. Before platformer rank, Cobster was a borderline top 10 player, and through hard work and determination he'd slowly get better throughout the coming months. This would eventually pay off when he became the second victor of Convolution in September 2025, moving him right behind Aibyou. And with him completing the Elephant's Foot right after, he'd knock Aibyou out of the top 2 for a single day. Shortly after, Tanuklen would also pass him. However, unable to be deterred, after completion of KAIJI, he'd reach a peak ranking of number 2, only behind the same person who blocked Tanuklen's status as the best player. During the middle of this year, Cobster would almost drop out of the top 10 while he was grinding Delightful Climb. However, by playing Null Deathless for fun, and by completing the unnerfed version of the Elephant's Foot, a demon he dropped after dying to the last spike, he bought himself enough time, and ultimately reclaimed a spot in the top 5 as the second victor of Delightful Climb.
Oh my god, I beat Delightful Climb! This level!
In addition, Cobster is a very talented level designer, as he both created and verified Project Buzzkill, a phenomenal high-paced level where various obstacles sync up with the music, which I highly recommend checking out. To round out the Eternal 5, we of course have Aumi, who jumped onto the scene in the middle of last year, surpassing Aibyou. He mainly focused on the top 10 levels and had the ability to beat levels in 2,000 to 3,000 attempts, where others would take tens of thousands. In fact, ever since he beat unnerfed Exorcist, Aumi in August would have the entire top 10 completed until the end of 2024. To put how far ahead Aumi was from the rest of the field into perspective, ever since the establishment of platformer rank, Aumi has blocked each Aibyou, Super Cobster, Tanuklen, and GToast from claiming the #1 rank 2 separate times. GToast not only had to beat Abyss and Null Deathless, but also verify the top 3 at the time, Convolution, Ruined, and Delightful Climb, while Aumi was on hiatus to take the #1 spot. With these 5 players taking up a slot, there's 5 more open for players looking to rank in the top 10. However, they are currently occupied by NNG, who has the unique distinction of spending at least one day but not every single day in the top 10 each month, GToast, the current best player by far, Dashing, the #1 Moongrinder, Voplat, the only player ever to surpass Aibyou on both TPL and platformer rank, and Artemka, who clawed their way outside the top 50 to the top 10 in the last half a year. These top 10 players form a seemingly impenetrable wall for anyone else to crack. However, platformer mode is still relatively new, and still has plenty of time for veterans like Shroomy, Rev, or recent rising stars like Evitz, Bananusa, and Retro to break through that ceiling, and I can't wait to see what happens next.